distinguished guests and colleagues, all protocol observed. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Derek Nseko. I'm CEO founder Airspace Africa, a publication that's dedicated to the African aviation industry. Now, I had a few conversations with Verengai, the project lead, and speaking about this panel. What struck me the most was the difficulty in populating this list of panelists, and that really says so much about our African aviation industry, because this conversation seeks to learn from those who got it right. You know, so perhaps if the panel sought to learn from those who failed or who did not get it right, we could have had, you know, an easier journey with that. But the motivation behind this forum is really to change that narrative. A narrative that is highlighted by inefficient, unsustainable business models, poor management, mismanagement, lack of adequate skills, and this terrible track record of loss-making that we have in the African aviation sector. Now, despite the bad report, we have some success stories to speak of. Airlines such as Airlink, FlySafair, Ethiopian, they've grown significantly over the past few years. They didn't just survive the pandemic, they emerged even stronger, you know, more resilient, doing better. And this without government aid. Airlink in particular has had a meteoric rise, becoming the largest full-service airline in the region, one of the largest in Africa. So it's really an honor to have you here, Rodger Foster, because as you know, and as I've alluded to, there's very few reference points for us to have this conversation. I also would like to reintroduce my other guest today, who is a seasoned aviation expert, seasoned aviation executive. Talk about full-service carriers, talk about low-cost carriers, talk about government-owned airlines, privately owned airlines. He's the embodiment of been there, done that. Sylvain Bosc, it's a pleasure to have you as well. Now, Rodger, 30 years, a remarkable journey. Congratulations on building an exemplary airline on the African continent. Now, in asking my question that I want to start with, I am really motivated by trying to figure out what you've done different. But I'd like to borrow from your journey just to understand what have been the defining moments in those past 30 years.
Derek, I thought we had time constraints. Gee, was where to begin. I think the first thing that I can reflect on, you mentioned 30 years, you mentioned, you know, how is it that Airlink is here today? I don't see how the timeline of 30 years has in fact gone by, and I think that that's a very important issue, because a lot has happened in that time. You know, we talk about black swan events and how they have reshaped the air travel sector, airlines. And airlines have come and they've gone, and there's been consolidations and collaborations and failures. And especially in, I think, the Southern African region. In fact, I think we could probably extend it to the whole of Africa. I think we've just been privileged to recognize very early on in that journey of 30 years that there is a big difference between flying passengers from point to point and flying passengers within a network system which is in communication with network systems around the world. that we recognize that the destinations that we have included in our network system for strategic reasons, and if one has a look, there's diversification, there's a blend of different types of destinations like Walfish Bay in Namibia, Windhoek itself, the Okavango swamps, the Delta, Maun, Chobe River. We've got 56. I'm not going to go through all of them, otherwise we will be here beyond today. But we've recognized that the source of travel is not necessarily within the network system. The source could be Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, North America. We're a data-focused business. Everything that we do is on the basis of facts and analytics, and then of course the talent that you have to have within an organization to drive that. We've realized the importance of collaborations and partnerships. In fact, one of the most defining moments, and this oracle next to me that flew all the way out from France, and I think that as a forum we can be very grateful for that, has had a vast amount of experience of state-owned enterprises here in Southern Africa. He knows about them, and I think that he is well positioned to talk about it, but you've asked me the question, so I'm not going to ask him to answer it. Probably the defining element was very early on in the piece realizing that we didn't want to compete with our national carrier. We wanted to work hand in glove, symbiotically, with our national carrier. And I think most people in the room are well aware that that was a marriage made in heaven, that there was mutual benefit flowing to both, that we grew a network of destinations under a franchise system which didn't cost the state of South Africa a single cent. No money was injected into our organization, yet we got the benefit of the scale of the collective. And we were able to grow our network from it. And unfortunately, that relationship came to naught in the end. And I think everybody burned their fingers really badly. That was a marriage that really failed. And we lost a lot of money, which was another defining moment. And when you go through that as a black swan event, and you go through COVID as a black swan event, and you realize what is the glue in an organization that keeps you focused and committed to survival. You talk about success. For me, success is survival. And it's the talent, the commitment of the people within the organization, not just within it, but outside of it as well. Your stakeholders, your business partners, your financiers, your shareholders, your lessors, your suppliers, service providers, etc. And I think that's where we didn't drop the ball. We looked after the people interaction, recognizing that people make business happen, not businesses make business happen. Our customers, we looked after, we concentrated all of our energies on reliability and on on-time performance. And we recognized the importance of working with government organizations, airports, service providers, Tosca SEM, BC Europe, a telephone call away. Please, we need to free up this logjam. What can we do about the GNSS approaches at Walvis Bay? Everything got dropped and it got resolved just like that. It's those kinds of relationships that make the world go round, and we recognize that. And I think if there was a glue to our organization and a reason for us surviving, it is those interpersonal relationships. I don't want to hog the forum all the time, Derek. Yeah. Can I stop at that juncture, or would you like me to carry on? Because I can.
So diversification, data-driven operations, skills, collaboration, people focus. Incredible.
Well, I think I'll add one more to you.
Yes,
because
I was going to ask you that question.
I worked together with Rodger when I was at SAA, so I could observe from my point of view. And I think there's two things that characterize Rodger and the organization, and that are key to the success is prudence. So you never took any risk, and that could be seen in your fit plan, in your network plan. And that is a massive learning that seems to be lost on many airlines in Africa, as they want to run before they walk. And I think that's something that you never did. And the second thing is, as a leader, you were extremely meticulous, and Rodger knows everything about his business because you've been, well, you founded it, and you are involved in every aspect. Not that you are micromanaging, but you are involved in every aspect of it. And that's another learning, is that I don't think you can build a successful airline if you don't have stability at the top. And I think that's also a key recipe for Airlink's enduring success.
Great points. And I'm just going to bring it back to you, Sylvain. And we sat here in Namibia. So much has been spoken about Air Namibia. Obviously, we saw the end of it not too long ago. And that definitely left a gap in the market. Further down south, Com Air is in the past. South African Airways is not what it used to be. How do you assess the current market at the moment in Southern Africa? And what are the opportunities? Is there an opportunity for market entry, for a new airline perhaps?
Well, there's definitely a huge opportunity ahead. As we saw this morning in the Airbus presentation, that was quite insightful. I think Africa is probably the only continent that still has got a huge aviation growth ahead of itself. In Europe, in America, the markets are much more mature. There's a lot of headwind with the environmental position. We have ground transportation alternatives that are very competitive. In France, domestic flights are now prohibited when there's a rail alternative of less than 3 hours. So it's going to become more and more difficult to fly in Europe and the US, but in Africa, there is still a huge area of growth ahead of us. But we need to remove the roadblocks that have been in the way. We mentioned some of those roadblocks earlier with the political decisions, the openness of the markets, etc. My personal favorite as a roadblock is government interference. I think that is the single most contributing factor to the situation of African aviation today. Is there's just been too much state involvement at the wrong level. So maybe we should have more involvement in infrastructure and maybe less involvement in running airlines themselves.
100%, I fully agree with you. And we were speaking about the market opportunity here, and it brought up you and Airlink. Obviously, there was an opportunity that you took up here in Namibia, in the Namibian market, and Airlink has bought a 40% stake in Fly Namibia, underpinned by a franchise partnership. So I'm thinking about this from the context of other partnerships on the African continent. There's been some very loud whispers of a Pan-African airline forming in certain parts of Africa, between the East and the South, and perhaps even the West will come on board. And we all know Ethiopian Airlines model. They have stakes in numerous airlines across Africa. Are these the beginnings of a more consolidated market on the African continent? How do you view consolidation as a part of our future?
Derek, I think you raise a lot of points, and the very important point that you raised is, there have been airline failures, and you've mentioned a few. You didn't mention them all, but South African Airways was a failed airline. It went into business rescue, and it's in the process of emerging out of business rescue as a version 2.0. Comair didn't quite enjoy the same, neither Mango nor SA Express, and the same to Air Namibia. And there are others within the sub-region and throughout the whole of Africa that are actually failed airlines. They are subsidized, and therefore they have survived. But for the subsidization, they would not have survived. And I think that I just reflect on Geert's presentation this morning. I'm going to pick on him now. And I think the before and after facts that were portrayed in his presentation don't really tell the story. There's a narrative behind it, and I think it's an important narrative to understand. And it goes about these airlines that we referred to didn't fail because of COVID. You mentioned it, Derek. They failed before COVID.
Yes.
I think COVID helped to process the failures that the airline industry had failed. So I think we've got to be careful when we look at Africa as an opportunity. And this is the after slide that Gert puts up, and I think that Dr. Stanku put up another interesting slide, and that is, we've got this great opportunity for the growth in Africa. I don't think we must see the opportunity without understanding why there was failure. And I'm just going to throw a pebble in the pond quickly and just look at Africa as a continent. It's a vast continent. And if you ask the other oracle of the industry, sometimes I think he's a professor, and that's Aaron Monetse, although he's not the chief executive of the Namibian Airports Company, that's Visi Europe. But, he says there are 55 states in Africa if you include Madagascar, and I think that that's probably right. And there's a vast population and a quickly growing population in Africa of 1.4 billion people, which more or less equals the total population of China, and more or less the same as India. But here's another interesting fact. I do believe there is a correlation between air transportation and its affordability, whether the affordability is disposable income in the individual's hands or in the hands of the corporate, which is funding that individual's travel. In Africa, the GDP per capita is $2,200 US, more or less. In China, the GDP per capita is $12,500 US, okay, just China alone. And the total GDP in China is 17.5 trillion US dollars. Germany, as a country which has got a great nexus with Namibia, and that's why I pick on it. Germany has a total population of 84 million people. Namibia's got a total population of 2.5 million people. Africa, 1.4 billion. The German economy, GDP, is 3.5 trillion US dollars. The whole of Africa is less than that. Now, how about that? When you look at 2,200 US dollars, I don't think we must overestimate the market, the travel market that is within Africa. We have to be realistic about what we do. It's often said, and this is an IATA statistic, and Alex, if I'm wrong, shout at me again, somewhere between 15 and 18% of the total global population live in Africa. But Africa has 1.9%, more or less, of the total air travel. And if you look at that relationship and the correlation of GDP per capita, I think it tells you the background story. Now, when we go further and understand why airlines in Africa have failed, so many airlines in Africa have failed, there is a common thread aside from the fact that the market can't sustain the number of airlines that we've had or the capacity that we've had. It goes about, there are a lot of airlines, and I'm going to pick on Air Namibia now. It's not here and it can't defend itself, that's why I pick on it. I think Air Namibia struggled to have a global reach and an infrastructure, including a booking system and a support base that could support what it was trying to achieve. I call it critical mass. If you have a head office and an accounts department and an HR department and a chief executive and a chief financial officer, chief commercial officer, and a booking system and a revenue accounting system and a revenue management system and a head of technical support, and all those underpins come to your infrastructural cost, which when pinned together with the assets that you deploy into your business becomes the critical mass of that business. You have to be able to generate more revenue than your critical mass. Otherwise, what you're doing is consuming equity. And Sylvain mentioned it. He said, one of the elements of Airlink and its ability to have survived is we looked after our balance sheet. We made sure we had equity and that we could convert the equity into liquidity and that we didn't consume our equity, but also that we were a business above our critical mass. And I think that that is a common thread throughout all of the smaller countries within Africa and all of the smaller airlines within those countries, none of which can afford to have that infrastructure because they don't generate enough revenue to cover themselves. In other words, they don't achieve critical mass. Collaboration, working together, you mentioned, why did we invest in Fly Namibia? We see that Fly Namibia is an organization that has got great potential. But would it be able to achieve its potential on its own? I think it would struggle. That's our view. I think they share that view because they've allowed us as an organization to invest, but not just to invest in the business, to lend our infrastructure to that business so that that business doesn't have to go and reinvent the wheel itself. Again, I don't want to hog the forum. Thanks, Derek.
Yes, Sylvain, how do you view collaboration as a pillar?
Well, I think it's what Rodger just mentioned is very interesting. In fact, when you run an airline, you run two businesses. One business is running the airline, meaning the aircraft, ground operations, flight operations. And then the other business is running a B2C, business-to-consumer business, online distribution, cash collection at the airport, etc. And it's got absolutely nothing to do with the airline business. It's a marketing, mass consumer business. And one of the successes of Airlink was that it was able to concentrate on the operation side of the business, on taking care of its balance sheet and making sure the operations were always the best so that they could grow in SAA's network. But they didn't have at Airlink to worry about the sales administration or the promotion because it was taken care of by SAA, which at the time was a very powerful brand. And what's really interesting for me from the outside is now you are replicating the same thinking, saying, okay, now because of the failure of SAA, you've had to learn to swim, and now you've developed a platform that enables you to sell successfully in Africa, but also abroad. But you want to leverage on that, and that the Fly Namibia cooperation is about you leveraging that marketing technique that you've just learned, and you put it at the service of an organization that is based on exceptional operational competence, because it's based on the West Air history of delivering excellent services for the oil and gas and mining industry, but which is completely remote from the knowledge of business to consumer marketing. So that's, I think it's a very smart cooperation in which it brings the two competencies together and to develop a valid airline in Namibia. I think that's probably a blueprint for others to learn from, which also is something that we tried to do when I was at FastJet, which like AirAsia also, or I think you can Jetstar also in Asia, whereby you have a marketing organization that is in charge of distribution, and then several airlines, AOCs, that operate in different countries, whereby they have their own operational expertise and local knowledge.
Yeah. Now, this country is, and this is also part of the motivation behind this forum, and the general agenda for the Namibian economy is trying to build a logistics hub. And I'm thinking about cargo, as a part of the airline's operation. I don't know how significant it is to your business and how important it is. How do you see cargo as an opportunity in Africa and perhaps even here in Namibia?
Well, firstly, it is an opportunity. Is it an important part of our business? It absolutely is an important part of our business. Up until now, we've been able to carry express parcels in the bellies of our passenger aircraft. But as the load factors increase, you have limited capacity for freight as payload, and you have to start thinking about alternatives. So one of the things that we did early on in the piece is we bought the freight capacity from our competitors, and then we filled it. And now they don't have any freight capacity left, but we still have freight demand. We also invested in a subsidiary business together with a global entity by the name of Worldwide Flight Services, which does the cargo handling for big organizations like Emirates and Turkish and a whole lot of other airlines, Lufthansa included, in South Africa, Johannesburg and Cape Town in particular. And we see that there is absolutely a need. We have to, however, again, recognize reality, and that is that at the moment freight moves, especially heavy freight moves extensively on the road. I think the rail infrastructure, certainly in South Africa, has all but collapsed. There are one or two lines that are still running, but we've got wholesale cable theft and fatigue on the rails. And I think that here there still may be an integrity of the system, but one has to think about the future and the sustainability of the roads as an infrastructure for the purposes of moving freight around. I think that air freight has a role, it's an increasing role, and to develop a freight hub, one has to think about which freight is going to be moving to and from and why. And I think that Namibia is blessed with wonderful economic and industrial development opportunities in terms of the green hydrogen and the oil and the gas. We talk about industrial development nodes like Luderitz and like Walfish Bay. I think there's going to be a big need in the short to medium term to move massive amounts of freight to support the industrial development that is happening at those nodes. So my view would be the freight market is opening up, and there needs to be a greater propensity for the air travel industry, airlines in other words, to move more towards dedicated freighters. We don't have enough dedicated freighters to serve the existing market, and I think that is a market opportunity.
Do you see it as an opportunity, Sylvain?
Absolutely, yes. I think it's what we see today, that the freight has become a very important part of Ethiopian Airlines' stability, actually. They managed to allocate much more capacity to freight, and that saved them during the pandemic. I think that's also a way forward for the continent. And
Sylvain, you've obviously been on different sides of the aisle, and you've gone through different models in terms of airline operations. What model would you see as the best fit in this sort of market, if you were to start an airline today?
Well, I've worked in different models, low cost, long haul, low cost, short haul, full service or regional. I think what's certain for me in Africa is you need small aircraft, and that's also the success. Yep. It's not a sufficient condition, because SA Express also had small aircraft, but they didn't make it. So you need to have small aircraft, because this is an area where you need frequency, because corporate travelers need frequency. And you don't have the volumes, and there's a lot of restrictions in terms of movement of people, and therefore for international travel you need short, small modules. So I believe low cost is probably not in the short-term horizon in many countries. It will only work where you have a strong domestic network, such as in South Africa, maybe Nigeria, and you have a big size of population, and also a certain level of development. The key to success in low-cost carriers is you need to have volumes, and you need to be able to stimulate demand with low prices. If you don't have a population base that has enough dispensable income to spend on recreational travel, there's no point in discounting. At FastJet, I remember there was a flight between Nairobi and Dar es Salaam competing against Kenya Airways. And you could give away the tickets. People were not traveling on FastJet. Even at $1, they would not travel. And the flights of Kenya Airways were full, because they had 4 daily flights on an Embraer. Sorry, Airbus, but I had to mention that one. So the lesson is what people wanted was not price, but convenience. And I think that's exactly what the future is for Africa, except in those countries where there's a big population base and economy will sustain GDP growth.
Yeah, and low cost does liberalize their services as well. Rodger, you have succeeded despite...
Survived.
Oh, you you have thrived. Yeah, would deregulation be a game changer for you as well?
I think it is a barrier at the moment, and I'd just like to pick up on the frequency issue, because we limited in frequency, not necessarily in terms of bilaterals. I note the bilateral air service agreement between Namibia and South Africa, or between South Africa and Mozambique, are quite liberal in terms of the number of frequencies that are available per the bilateral. So that's not the constraint. The constraint is we've got our own regulatory framework, and one of the requirements is that we have to make an application to a council. It's got to be gazetted, the council has to consider it, and then they've got to decide, are you going to get more frequencies or not? But if we really truly want to liberalize, if an airline has the economic opportunity and the reach, the global reach through its relationships, like we've got 25 interline relationships with key players in the world like Qatar and Emirates and Lufthansa and British Airways and Air France and KLM, and United and Delta and Cathay and all of them. And it's because they are in communication with the source markets, and they're all in and out pulsating, not only in our hubs, Johannesburg and Cape Town, but also you've got Qatar and Eurowings Discover, which is Lufthansa really, coming in and out of here, Windhoek. What we've got to be able to do is build frequency with smaller gauge aircraft so that we can hit the arrivals of most of our partners and defeed their flights and refeed their flights, recognizing that we don't just carry passengers from Johannesburg to Windhoek. We carry passengers from all over the world through Johannesburg to Windhoek. And they don't just go to Windhoek. Sometimes they go to Walfish Bay, sometimes they go to Lüderitz, sometimes they go to Ondangwa. So we've got to build these network systems, and the lack of liberalization is inhibiting the development of these matrix network systems that will open up air travel throughout the region, bearing in mind that when people come to Windhoek, they don't just come to Namibia. They travel into Windhoek as a gateway. They also go to Victoria Falls, or they go to Okavango Swamps, or they go to Cape Town, or wherever. And we've got to enable that, and we're not doing that at the moment. So yes, it is a barrier.
Okay, thank you. And I think before we go to the audience, because I can see time is really running, let's just look to the future. What are the trends going forward? Is there any formula? I know there is a panel coming up on national airline, and it's part of the broader discussion of this Namibian forum. But is there a formula for the airline of the future in this region?
Well, I don't want to keep on repeating what my colleague is saying, but I believe that we have to develop network systems built on frequency, availability, and the timing of the flights so that they coincide and connect with global carriers, like all of those that I've met. And for me, the model is to develop the networks as matrices around the entire sub-region. Collaboration is key, and I think the Fly Namibia relationship with Airlink epitomizes what we need to be doing, replicating that elsewhere as well. But we don't want to just sort of jump into a replication. We want to first perfect that and make sure that Fly Namibia thrives and it reaches its full potential, developing network systems in and out of domestically and within the region from Namibia. So that's the way we see the future developing. We're going to have low-cost carriers that are going to be on routes like Johannesburg, Windhoek, and possibly Cape Town, Windhoek, and we're going to have to compete with them. But where we've got a competitive advantage is we feature our inventory through our relationships with those global carriers that I've mentioned to the whole world as the source market. And we don't just localize it, we globalize it.
Amazing. Quickly, I would like to take some questions or comments from the audience. If you have, just put your hand up. Just two questions, actually. Two. Yes. All right.
Why they're still on Kenyan? I didn't quite understand why they were still flying Kenyan versus the other airline. Could you just elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes. So the principle of a low-cost carrier is price elasticity. So you reduce your fares, and then because your fares are reduced, you get a higher share of the market, and then you can reduce your fares because you have a lower cost than the full service operator. But in some cases, it just doesn't work. So between Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, probably 90% of the passengers are either connecting in Nairobi or they are traveling for business. So what they're looking for is the convenience, the on-time performance. They want an early morning departure and a late evening return. Or if they want to meet their flight, they want to meet their flight that matches with their onward connecting flight, and they want only one ticket so that the entire journey is covered by one contract transport. Fastjet was offering only one flight a day, and people were not going to buy two separate tickets because they don't want to be inconvenienced in case of delay. And therefore, the only fraction of the clientele that we could attack were those who were price sensitive and traveling on leisure. And this clientele just is very, very tiny on most international flights in Africa. And that's why Fastjet failed miserably on international flights. And domestically, it worked very well because on domestic flights for point to point, when you reduce fares, families reunite, students travel, trades, people can go and sell whatever they want back home or import stuff. And therefore, when you reduce the price, you make it worth traveling. And that was happening domestically, but internationally it didn't work. And look, I think it would be very interesting to see how FlySafair succeeds on the Windhoek route, because it's, I think it will be their first international venture. And it's a very different game, and I'm not sure that low-cost travel internationally is ready.
Can I, Derek, if I can just add to that, just to give a slightly different angle to the answer, and that goes about Kenya Airways has a hub and spoke system in Nairobi. Kenya Airways has a strong working relationship with KLM and Air France and other international carriers through interline relationships and code share relationships. So it's the exact example of what I was talking about earlier on. It is reaching source markets all over the world, funneling them through Nairobi and then carrying them on to a destination like Dar es Salaam. It's providing great connectivity with high frequency of service in and out of Nairobi from the world to and from Nairobi, and then from Nairobi within its network with frequency using, for example, a 100-seater aircraft. So it's been able to tap the world's source market, bring them through Nairobi, then onto a destination like Dar es Salaam, but with high frequency. So the high frequency satisfies multifacets of the market. The same-day returning businessman that you're referring to, but also the leisure traveler going across to Zanzibar, coming from Canada or North America or anywhere. So it's that model which I believe is the long-term sustainable model. We're going to have competition with low-cost carriers, and that price elasticity is going to be tested. But it's not always going to work, because the market doesn't originate at the local level only. It originates at the global level, the source markets all over the world.
Oh, brilliant. I think in the interest of time, we are going to have to end the panel here. One more question. Okay.
Rodger spoke about equity balance. Did we find an optimal financing model of airlines? If we see successful airlines, most of them, maybe except in America, are government-owned, except Airlink. If you see Emirates, Qatar, you see British Airways. I'm sure, I don't know about France. Is that because of the absence of that equity balance, or did we not have a proper financing model to have a successful airline?
Okay, I think we can both answer it. I think you raised some very interesting examples, and I think these are examples where the government is fully integral with the airline, and there has been a national strategy based on the geographic, strategic location of that country. So the Middle East is interestingly termed. It's the Middle East because it's in the middle of the world. And I think that in itself has created a geographic opportunity for hub-and-spoke network systems to develop. And the first one that really emerged as a powerful global airline was Emirates. And in the Middle East, the countries all compete with each other. They're highly competitive. They even competed with each other to see who was going to host the World Cup. And it ended up as being Qatar. And Qatar, not coincidentally, has earned the position of the world's best airline over the last 6 or 7 years, for good reason. Now, those governments created strategies for connecting the world, but also premised on how the airport received or facilitated and enabled that particular airline to build that connectivity. And, those have been national strategies. I think to replicate it in Southern Africa, one has to think about the geographic disadvantage that we have. And, the affordability as well. Those countries are hugely wealthy. They are of the wealthiest countries in the world. And it's been part of their national beneficiation strategy to take the raw material, oil, and convert it into global connectivity, if I could put it that way. Sylvain.
Yeah, I think one thing also that we might add is a lot of airlines that have failed because they didn't have the financial resources to basically finance new assets. And that's also a typical mistake that many airlines in Africa have been doing repeatedly, is acquiring new aircraft, which they can't really finance, and at the end of the day, drown under debt. I don't know how many new aircraft have you been buying in your career, but probably you can count them on one hand, right? Because second-hand aircraft are much less expensive, and it's much more prudent, and it requires much less financing to acquire those than to acquire new aircraft. So I think that's also a recipe for success, is to probably try the routes, try your network with second-generation aircraft, second-hand aircraft, and once you are absolutely certain that you need the extra performance that a new aircraft can convey, then you can acquire a new aircraft. That would be difficult to finance.
I think you talk about the financing model, Dr. Hangala. It goes about don't incur debt before you've got equity. And that's 100% correct. If you take a look at all the airlines that have failed, including in Namibia and South African Airways. South African Airways failed, and when it failed, it needed government intervention, recapitalization, 16 billion, whatever it was. But the stakeholders funded 32 billion in their losses. That was recapitalization of that business. Now, how on earth can a business support that kind of debt? The same with Mango, the same with Comair. Comair had a debt equity ratio of something like 7 to 1. 7 times equity was debt. No airline business, no business, doesn't matter what the business is, can support that kind of debt. So the key to the financial model is you need capitalization, but don't incur more debt than your equity, because the capitalization brings your equity. And then you start developing it organically. You've got to get that business above its critical mass as quickly as you can, so that you can start regenerating equity. And when you're building equity, then you can take on more debt. But you can't take on more debt before you've built the equity. So you have to be profitable at the end of the day, and sustainably so. Derek, just
thank you.
In my last comment, I want to, just from my heart,
Go ahead.
express my sincere appreciation to Namibia, to BC, for inviting me to come here today. But more than that, Airlink never dropped the ball. Through COVID, we talk about connectivity, we talk about air access, the air bridge between a country and the world. And I'm very, very proud, but I can't be proud on my own, because the characters here, including Dr. Hangala and Dr. Cedric Limbo, and they saw that Airlink was ready to step up to the plate, and they facilitated it. And this is not just about Namibia, because we saw the same thing in Zimbabwe. When there was no connectivity to Victoria Falls, they facilitated that Airlink would get access to that market as quickly as they could. And we just want to express our appreciation and show our sincere commitment to communities like Namibia. And proudly, through that COVID, I'm also very, very proud to say we never lost a single staff member. We didn't make a single job redundant. We never dropped the ball anywhere. There was no market that we abandoned, not even one. And we've been able to sustain the business on the basis of our commitment, on our reliability. We've got on-time performance of 96%, and that's over 75,000 flights a year that we do. So, and we're just very, very proud of the relationships that we've got with the government of Namibia and others, and the people in particular. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the reason why we're here really is because we really are proud of what you guys have achieved at Airlink as well. And thank you so much for an insightful discussion, the both of you. Please put your hands together for... Yeah.